Fitzsimons. I'm the technical director at Water Resources East. I'm aware that there's a mixture of people on this call. There's people that have heard things like the slides I'm about to present to death, and there's others that will be hearing this stuff for the first time. So I'll kind of try to cover things in a bit of a middle ground of detail, but broadly skim over some of the stuff that the guys have just spoken about from a water resource planning perspective, from the water companies side of things. So I'll try my best as I'm going through these. I've just been kind of making a few adjustments to my slides as they've been talking. I'll do my best to try and pick out what's different about regional planning, and maybe how that fits into the context of catchment planning and the things that catchment-based approaches and the groups associated with that might want to be thinking about. So for those that aren't aware, Water Resources East is one of 5 regional planning groups. We cover right down from the patch that Liz was talking about in Essex all the way up to the South Humber Bank, and slicing the country down the middle. That's broadly our region there. So we border through our existence, although we emerged as a group back in 2019 formally. A big driver for our existence and the development of a regional water resources plan really came out of the Water Resources National Framework, which was published in early 2020 by the Environment Agency. And this really set these 5 regional groups the task to develop the ambition was a multi-sector, long-term plan for water resources that took account of the environment and the economic constraints around water use within each region. Each regional group is set up quite differently. There are different levels of their kind of organizational maturity. Water Resources East actually being one of the more mature groups. Water Resources Southeast has been going in some form since the 90s, bringing together water company planning processes. But particularly the ones in the North and the West Country are pretty new in their ability to come together and provide formal resource and formal funds behind joint work, and particularly work around multi-sector and catchment scale activity. So I'll come on some of that in just a sec. But our work to date really culminated just before Christmas in the publication of the first regional plan, water resources plan for the East of England. So that's available on our website. We can share links after this session for you to have a look through at your leisure. But I'll try and pull out some of the key points and explain to you where it fits in the wider context in this presentation. So just to say how we're a little bit different from what Liz and Becky were just talking about there, and how we're different from the other 4 regional groups, is that we are quite proud to say that our board is genuinely multi-sector. It consists of our primary funding members, which is broadly a 70-30 split between the water companies and our non-public water supply, our non-water company funding members. But then we've also got a couple of positions on the board that are stakeholder positions. So our representatives from the Revival Group is an example of the Rivers Trust being those that have a seat at our board, that take part in our decision-making processes, but we do not have to pay to be there on the board to do that. So that's something we're particularly proud of. And just to briefly say, here's a ridiculously busy slide. We've got in excess of 180 members of Water Resources East that attend our strategic advisory group meetings, which some of you I know already attend, and have an opportunity to shape our thinking and the way we want to do our planning in the future. Okay, so this is a figure that's taken from our regional plan. So if you're kind of interested to pore over this a little bit more, it's in our regional plan. It's referenced there. It's figure 1.3. But I've added a couple of little annotations and red dashed boxes to help put it in the context of this session today. So hopefully you can see my mouse. Here we are down here with the regional water resources plans, and you can see there's a green blob, which means it's a non-statutory plan. So in contrast to what Becky and Liz were saying, their plans being statutory processes or representing a statutory process they have to follow. The regional water resources plans, as they stand now, and the signals we're getting for the next round of planning, will remain non-statutory. And that really gives us the opportunity to think a little bit bigger, a bit broader. What are some of the bigger issues we need to be tackling? Are there some things that we could be working on at a more local scale that have perhaps less certainty around them and less kind of government-led interventions and statutory vehicles to implement the solutions around them? So I think from my perspective, we sit in this quite unique space where we have an opportunity to then play into all these other things that are kind of radiating off from it. So the local nature recovery strategies, influencing and being informed by local development plans, local flood risk management strategies, climate change and mitigation strategies. And these are the things that the CABA groups will be more familiar with at a catchment scale. So in addition to that, we've also got acting in different levels and different scales are the agri-food industry, the energy industry, other industries that require water from the environment. That can include IDBs and navigation and other management. And I just wanted to really just kind of throw this up here and say that whilst this is a really big context for the whole of water resources planning across the country, starting with the 25-year environment plan, handing down to the national framework, giving us the remit to develop a plan. Really, this, I think, this red hash box here is where the interesting space that we're looking to work with people like yourselves on. But outside of that box, the big opportunity over the coming years really is the stuff that Liz and Becky were talking around the Water Industry National Environment Programme. So down here, this is where some of that catchment level investigation, modelling, options appraisal to identify where are these new sources of supply going to come from, not just to benefit public water supply and the users that benefit from that network, but also other independent abstractors. So that this is where we're really going to need to be coming out to catchments collectively and working together to figure out what is the catchment scale, local environmental evidence that can build upon the higher level statutory duties that are implicated through the environment plan, and how we can actually start to tailor our approach, how we can find optimum solutions to delivering what we want in our catchments for the environment that doesn't just blanket cut all licenses, that all abstraction licenses for those that need that water for that benefit the local economy and individual businesses. So it's quite a complex picture, and the picture is kind of building up all the time. There's lots of work emerging from the Environment Agency around improving tools and processes for agricultural water resources planning in particular. There's lots of work from the energy sector looking to get better at forecasting their water needs for the production of hydrogen in particular, but also cooling water for power stations and energy production in more traditional methods. But there's also incentives or a view that we should incentivize the creation of more water abstractor groups within catchments. So these are, some of you again may be involved in some. The LARC has one that's a multi-sector. The Broadlands Water Abstractor Group is a long-standing group that focuses on agriculture, but it is looking to expand. The ESWAG, the Suffolk Water Abstractor Group, is another one. So if we're highly supportive of those groups and CABA groups coming together to help us build this bottom-up evidence base of what we can do, that then sets the regional plan in a much stronger footing to become what it really set out to be in the first instance, a multi-sector plan. Just one other thing to say on kind of where we are in our overall evolution. We've just updated our business plan. So this is a business plan that takes us through the next few years, setting out our strategic priorities. But we've retained our vision for water resources, which is the stuff that I've just really said. It's to have sufficient water resources to support that flourishing economy, a thriving environment, meet those population growth ambitions that we have across the country, and recognise that has to be done in a collaborative way. So, but the big thing again for the purpose of this session is just to recognise that we really are moving in the direction of having a fully multi-sector plan, and the one that works across catchment scales. So in terms of what our regional plan, if you were to open it from before Christmas, actually does, in contrast to the water company plans, it outlines the water needs, both now and in the longer term, out to 2050, of other sectors in the region. I'll come back to that in a second. It forecasts the amount of water that might be available to supply those sectors, recognising the pressures of climate change, a need to leave more water in the environment than we have historically done when environmental rules were perhaps less ambitious. And what it does as a kind of key focal point of our planning process is brings together the plans of Anglian Water, Essex and Suffolk Water, Cambridge Water, a portion of Affinity Water, and brings all those options and the optimization process together into one coherent view. And that's then, by extension, given us the ability to look beyond our regional boundary and explore whether we could benefit from or benefit others in trading water between regions. So there's lots of talk in the news and more widely around a national water grid. Now, that's something that's a long way off or perhaps will never happen, but there are genuinely really good examples already of sharing water across regional boundaries. So we've got one that we'll bring in the early 2030s, making use of a scheme that actually starts all the way up in the northwest of the country. So, and if we've got time later on, we can talk a little bit more about that. But really where it kind of stops and where we want to progress is this last point. It's just started to describe the type of work we need to be doing across sectors at catchment level to move ourselves forward. There's a really strong recognition that Water Resources East and regional planning's existence this time around has moved us a long way forward in knowing what we need to do, but there haven't really been the mechanisms and the processes and the funding processes to get that work off the ground. But there's genuine interest now coming down from government and the Environment Agency to support that kind of work. So it's quite an exciting time now to start learning more about this process and finding out how we can all get involved. So I've got a few slides here really then just to touch on the big hitting themes contained within the regional plan. But just wanted to start off with a bit of a reminder of how it all builds up and what we have at our disposal to help us know whether we're developing the right plan or not. Essentially, in the middle here, we've got a non-exhaustive list of all the stuff that needs to be collated to form a plan. So you need to understand what your supplies are at the moment, how they might change in the future under climate change. We need to understand our demand forecasts. We need to look at different scenarios, bearing in mind there's different uncertainties. We've already talked about climate change and different drought conditions, but also scenarios of how big our ambition wants to be at different scales for the environment, and the major bearing that has on how much water we might need to start leaving back in the environment. But a key thing that we do have as a region is a regional simulator. So this is effectively a regional model where we can play in these multi-sector demands and see how the model itself chooses to optimize based on a number of metrics that do cover the environmental needs, agricultural needs, energy needs. And so we can make sure that we're genuinely taking a view of water company strategic options, knowing whether they're good or bad for these other sectors prior to getting into the detail where we understand what options they might need. So what I'm going to do now is skim through a couple of slides, bearing in mind some of it's been spoken about already, but just an important distinction here is around this wider multi-sector demand. So I just added a little annotation here following the chat just now that what this slide is describing is here on the left, this big bar is the current and potential future additional water the public water supply network might need by 2050. So this covers what Liz was just talking about, the household and the non-household, the business users that benefit from the public water supply network. So that's this really big bar here, really big bar here over on the left. And all the ones down here in the red hatching, these are what we refer to in water supply in terms as non-public water supply users. So these are other businesses, other users that have abstraction licenses of their own issued by the Environment Agency, either recently with environmental flow conditions or perhaps historically with simply an annual limit and a go for it, put the pump in the river kind of approach. But these include our agricultural, in particular spray irrigation licenses held by the power and energy sector, those held by the navigation sector, which may or may not be consumptive in terms of whether they take water from the environment or whether they move it around, and a number of others through other industries, the food and drink sector. But what you can see here really is that it's at a regional level, the amount of water we take from the environment is dominated by public water supply. However, in any given catchment, in any given week of the year, the balance might change. And there are examples where spray irrigation in a particular week of the year can be the dominant abstractor, the dominant water user in a particular catchment. So that's a really important thing to think about when we talk a lot about 2050 and long-term planning horizons, but actually at a local scale in shorter timeframes, the pressures can shift around somewhat. And the only other thing I wanted to point out here that has a bearing on this group is really about the recognition there's a lot more work to be done to improve our understanding of future water demand across sectors, how our land use change is going to play into irrigation needs, how are targets for lowland peat restoration actually going to impact our water demands across catchments. And these are some of the themes that we picked up, as I understand it, in the next 2 sessions as part of this training program. So you'll hear much more about that, I'm sure, from others. So then just making it kind of real, this idea of returning water to the environment, I just want to touch on 2 things. That it's driven by what's there. It's driven by real things in the environment across the region that either people care about strongly or have very strong statutory protections. So that ranges from our chalk stream environments through to our internationally designated wetlands and everything in between, really. But depending on the nature of the environment's designation, what we've been able to do as a region and across water companies, working with the Environment Agency, is effectively reassign how much flow, how much water needs to be left in the environment. It's that mechanism, it's an awareness of where these water dependent features are across the region that's led to the development of our understanding of how much water needs to be clawed back effectively. And that's the reduction in extraction licenses that Liz spoke about before. But what this slide is effectively saying here is, from a public water supply perspective, it's not all being done in year one of the planning horizon, and it's not all being pushed back until 2050. There's a profile of our ability to scale back on abstraction from these freshwater dependent environments based on the existence of schemes that can replace that water that's then needed. So some of them around Cambridge and in Essex and Suffolk, licence caps for preventing further deterioration in the environment, or perhaps even for the new Habitats Directive regulations are going to kick in from the early years of the planning period, 2025, 2030. But some of the others need to wait until the Fens Reservoir is available or Links Reservoir is available in order to allow those abstraction reductions to take place. And one final thing I want to say on this environmental destination is that this is going to be the responsibility of everyone. All of those public water supply and non-public water supply users that hold abstraction licenses need to have a real strong think about where they might end up facing pressure on their existing abstraction licenses in order to deliver the environmental improvements that we want. So you can see on this slide here, in the top row, you've got public water supply, but then in the bottom, a very similar position with lots of reds all across the map for agriculture in this case, with some catchments potentially seeing up to a 60% loss of their overall annual license volume, which is a huge amount. What we're going to hope to do over the coming years is figure out what that percentage really looks like and whether there's any smarter ways we can deliver the environmental improvements without harming those businesses. I will skip through some of these because they've been dealt with, and I just wanted to dash down to this slide here. So both Becky and Liz have talked about the range of supply options that are being plugged into the water supply network over the coming years and by 2050. And this map shows that from a whole regional perspective. So this includes those options that benefit Cambridge Water's customers, a portion of Affinity Water, as I say, and goes all the way from north to south in our region. So they're all there. They're all in the plan. They're adaptive pathways, as the guys have said, and our own regional plan has adaptive pathways. But the big question here now for us, as we move into the next phase, is what do we do about the stuff on the right-hand side of this slide, and how does that factor into our idea of what a strategic level water resource plan means? Bearing in mind, some of these are schemes that are going to be benefiting local users at a really local scale, but that's not to say they're less important in our overall need for water in the region and the impacts that has on the economy and our local and wider environmental ambitions. So some of the stuff we're really keen to explore, working through processes that are underway with the Environment Agency and the agricultural sector in particular, is local resource options. So this is stuff that's going to allow, there's actually a bidding process that's going to, I think there's a press release coming out next week from the Environment Agency where catchment groups and water abstractor groups and groups of farmers will be able to bid in to have a study done to see if there are any local resource options available to them that can be set in the context of this wider strategic plan. And beyond that, there's a huge interest now, and we're looking into projects that we can do that build on the evidence base behind nature-based solutions, working with natural processes to hold back and store more water in the environment, increase recharge to our groundwater supplies, which in turn, as Liz said, improve base flow to rivers. So there's lots of work that we need to do over the next couple of years, both as part of our long-term planning, but also as part of those environmental destination investigations that Becky talked about. And this is where people from Rivers Trust, people on this call, can have a major role to play. So I think there's one last slide for me here, just on the timeline of how this all pans through. We've seen the publication just before Christmas of this round of regional plan, and we're now working very closely with the Environment Agency on the new national framework. So I talked about March 2020 as the first national framework that set us the task of kicking this process off. Well, that's going to be renewed in spring next year, and our remit will kind of evolve with that. But there's a number of things we absolutely know we need to get started on, and that's these environmental destination investigations in particular. But that's all going to point towards this kind of this critical period around 2026, 2027, when we're going to start understanding our future needs in a little bit more detail and understanding the options available to us both strategically and locally, with a view that we can publish our final plan, or next round of regional planning, I should say, towards the end of the 2020s. And that's an important point to make, that this is going to be constantly evolving. There's always going to be new environmental pressures, there's going to be new policies coming through, we'll have a better understanding of climate change and where we want things to go. So this will, we hope, become a regular rolling process, but one that we hope will be successful. And that's it from me.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. It's really interesting. Does anyone have any quick questions for Ben before we move on to the next session? If not, what we might do is move on and keep it moving, and then we'll have a time at the end for questions. So you've got time to think maybe a bit more for any questions related to that presentation. Okay, great. So the next part of this webinar is looking at catchment partnerships and giving a bit of a catchment partnership perspective. So what we're going to do is we've got a few different catchment partnerships on the call. So we're just really briefly going to hear from them about their kind of current experiences in this area. And then we'll hear from Sam to give a bit of a Rivers Trust Cabba perspective for us.